event on the role of science in evaluating the effectiveness of conventions. My name is Monika Stankiewicz, and I'm the Executive Secretary of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. The Minamata, a few words about the convention. Minamata Convention is a young convention. We celebrated the 3rd anniversary on 16th of August. The convention already has 123 parties, and it regulates the entire life cycle of mercury with the aim to protect human health and the environment from emissions and releases of mercury. And the first effectiveness evaluation of the convention is to be done by the Conference of the Parties by 2023. We are gathering on the sidelines of the 12th meeting of the open-ended working group of the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. And during the side event, we will hear presentations from 4 panelists, which will be followed by a discussion. Due to the time constraints, we'll not be inviting questions from the floor this time. Please also note that the event is being recorded, and we will make the recording available on the convention website afterwards, along with the presentations. Emily Reinaud from the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions will be assisting us with technical matters. And Emily, I would like to put the opening slide on, please. This is the first slide from my presentation. Oh, it's there. Thank you. Now, I think it's a time I introduce the panelists, and I'm actually very excited to have in our virtual room 4 distinguished panelists. Michael Spilsbury, who is the Director of the Evaluation Office of UNEP. Anna Maria Witt, the Program Officer of the Science and Technical Assistance Branch from the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. Jerker Tamelander, coordinator of the COBSEA, which is a coordinating body on the seas of East Asia, and Dominic Pattinson, the Executive Secretary of the Convention for the Protection of the Marine Environment of the Northeast Atlantic, OSPAR Convention. OSPAR Convention, so thank you so much for joining us. We know that parties in each of our organizations need to assess extent to which implemented policies are reaching the goals set for the conventions and programs. And some of our organizations have been doing assessments and evaluations for decades. Some others, like Minamata Convention, are now establishing a framework for evaluating the effectiveness of the convention. And this side event is an opportunity to explore this topic together with other conventions in the chemicals and waste cluster, regional sea conventions and action plans, and UNEP. And before I invite our panelists to present, I would like to a little bit explain what we mean when we talk about effectiveness evaluation. And if I could, Emily, ask you to put the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So I would like to a little bit take a few moments to explain what we mean by effectiveness evaluation, because I'm sure in many organizations we use different terms. So evaluation, and it's this is now the 3rd slide, but please go back to the 2nd slide. Thank you. So evaluation may include information on the level of implementation of the convention or program by parties, and this is often based on reporting by parties. It may include evaluation of the effectiveness of measures, in other words, quantitative or semi-quantitative information on how much measures, how much pressures and impacts on the environment and human health are reduced as a result of implementing a single or group of measures. It includes assessments of the status, pressures, and impact on the environment and human populations. And lastly, it may also include evaluation of the convention or program itself, its operation and sufficiency of the existing measures to reach the goals. If we can stay on the 2nd slide, please. Thank you so much. And all these 4 components are linked with each other, and it can be included into a single assessment process, can be addressed separately and in an iterative manner. And in most of those steps, if not all of them, science plays a role. I'm soon to ask the first presenter to present. Still, I would like to make one point, and I would like to recognize that it's not only scientific knowledge that is of relevance and use, but also local knowledge and of indigenous peoples. And I hope there will be opportunities in the future to to talk to that topic as well. But now, Michael, I would like to give the floor for you to present first. You are familiar with both the theory and practice of evaluations. So what does it take to put in place a fit-for-purpose effectiveness evaluation system which is based on the best available science? The floor is yours.
Wow, that's a very big first question. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at this side event. Whilst I wait for the first slide to come up, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Mike Spilsbury. I'm the Director of the Evaluation Office at UNEP, and I've been working in evaluation for about 25 years now, and 15 of them at UNEP. The first slide, when it comes up, just introduces the Evaluation Office of UNEP, which is a small independent office. So it works independently of the management of UNEP and looks at all the projects and programs of UNEP under a program of work. It has a mandate that doesn't extend to the UNEP Convention Secretariat, though, so we focus mainly on the evaluation of all of the projects and programs under the program of work. And of course, we focus a lot on the issue of effectiveness. I'm just going to wait now. If you can get the slides up for my presentation, that'd be great. So we skip to the next one, which I think I've already covered. Yeah, we've done that one. So now we're on this one. Great. So talking about effectiveness, which is really about whether something is meeting its objectives. So the first point I want to make here in terms of organising and doing evaluation is the first sort of key point and piece of advice is to have a very clear definition of what it is you're going to evaluate. The evaluand, we call it in evaluation circles. And Monica was just speaking to the range of things that are sometimes talked about under the banner of effectiveness evaluations. Now, whatever you're defining as the thing that you're going to evaluate, that's a really important decision because it defines and bounds what it is you're going to look at and look at the effectiveness of, look at the extent to which that thing is meeting its objectives. And when we're talking about effectiveness in general, we're really talking about intentionality. How is it that something is achieving its objectives or not, as the case may be? So having a clear and in-depth understanding of intentionality associated with an evaluand is a key part of setting up an effective evaluation arrangement. And just a few words on key attributes of evaluation. We often talk about these attributes in terms of the credibility, legitimacy, and utility. Now, for an evaluation to be credible, it has to achieve a certain level of quality and has to have very rigorous approaches. And the issue of credibility is also associated with processes and arrangements for evaluation. So I put here impartiality is what we're seeking to achieve in an evaluation. So you have a balanced view, judgments based on evidence that are impartial. And this is associated also with the issue of independence. So having an evaluation arrangement that is independent of the thing being evaluated can help safeguard impartiality. So you can see lots of situations where you may have management running a so-called evaluation. Well, they may have biases. So this is why it's good practice in the international arena to have evaluation functions that are independent. Another key part of credibility is to make sure that evaluations and evaluation processes are transparent, where all those that are interested in an evaluation can actually see what it's based on, understand the process, everything's clear and transparent, key people get to comment, which segues into the issue of legitimacy. Having a legitimate evaluation is also key. You know, that means having due process, having proper representation and balanced views. So when we're talking about science in evaluation, making sure that different aspects of science and science that is produced by not just Western science organizations, but science that is truly global and representative of the fields that we're talking about needs to be considered, and that means you will have a greater chance of having an evidence base that is seen by all those that are interested in an evaluation as being legitimate. And credibility and legitimacy sort of come together when you start thinking about utility. Evaluations are done because they're supposed to be useful. To be useful, they have to be relevant and timely. But if you think about it, they're not going to be used if they're not perceived as being credible or legitimate. So these things kind of closely interrelated. We'll move on to the next slide. Thanks, and the final one. So the question we're discussing in this side event today is how can science assist in having effective evaluations? Well, science clearly underpins robust monitoring. There's a lot of environmental related conventions that do a lot of environmental monitoring, but robust scientific monitoring underpins credible evaluation. Science clearly informs how we understand how change happens in the real world, and we're talking about all realms of science here: biophysical science, economics, social, behavioral, policy science. All of those domains of science help us understand how change happens in the real world. And if we're interested in effectiveness, we're essentially interested in how change comes about. So science, all realms of science have a potential role in effectiveness evaluation. And clearly science underpins evaluation processes and methods. If we think about what's going on in the world outside at the moment, we've got different organizations all around the world racing to produce vaccines for COVID-19, and many of them are doing evaluations of the effectiveness of those vaccines using randomized control trials. It just so happens that in the context of many of the environmental conventions, randomized control trials are often difficult to set up. So evaluations are often looking at mixed methods approaches, but clearly have a strong scientific underpinning. And finally, I'm talking here a little bit about theory of change models, and these theory of change models can be used as a good organizing framework to apply multidisciplinary science, not just for evaluation, but also for management and for monitoring to inform evaluation. And what do I mean by that? Often we hear dialogues that sort of dismiss the sort of linear change models that theories of change are often depicted as. But I think it's important just to remember that a theory of change model is just a conceptual framework. It's a way of sharing an understanding of how change happens. And I often like to think about, you may depict a policy change process, for example, as a box and an arrow connecting, policy advice to policy change. But just because it's depicted that way in a theory of change model doesn't mean that science knowledge implies that it's just a linear change model. You could zoom in on that particular policy change process and unpick it and see the iterative nature of it, and zoom in and see all the different factors at play in those policy change processes. So if you like, a theory of change model is zooming out and giving you a broad overview, but providing you with a framework to organize information relating to management, monitoring, and evaluation. With that, I'll stop and allow my colleagues to speak. And thanks very much for listening and for the time and the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mike. You mentioned in your presentation about credibility and legitimacy, and actually the latter part of the side event will come back to those attributes. So thank you for highlighting them already now. As many of our, I guess, participants and many of our sister organizations and colleagues know, the Minamata Convention cooperates closely with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. And in fact, the wording on effectiveness evaluation in the Minamata Convention have some common elements with those in the Stockholm Conventions. I'm very happy to have Anna in the panel. And the floor is yours to present what does it take to put in place a fit-for-purpose effectiveness evaluation system, which is based on best available science.
Thank you, Monica, and good morning, everyone. So short introduction of myself as well. My name is Anna Witt, and I have been working with the DRS Secretariat for a bit more than a decade by now, and have been deeply involved in issues with respect to effectiveness evaluation. A lot of work on the Stockholm Convention process, but this is not the main reason why my talk today will be focused a lot on the Stockholm experience, but it's because it provides a very good example of a well-established process that has been put in place to meet the requirements of the Convention, of the Article 16 of the Stockholm Convention on monitoring and evaluation. And before I begin, I would also like to note that the first effectiveness evaluation of Stockholm Convention, according to the adopted framework, has taken place between 2010 and 2017. And the lessons learned and the outcomes that I will present today are based on the results of this latest process in accordance with the framework adopted by the Conference of the Parties. Today we are discussing how science can support processes for effectiveness evaluation, and this discussion can go various ways, and it needs to address the process, the framework, the methodologies, but I would like to start by focusing on data, because without an adequate information basis and data available for the evaluation, the process for evaluation would be extremely difficult. Article 16 of the Stockholm Convention mentions three main streams of information to be used for effectiveness evaluation. First and foremost, monitoring data on levels and trends of concentrations of persistent organic pollutants in the environment and in human populations, provided through a long-term, well-established program, a global monitoring plan for persistent organic pollutants. Second, information provided by parties on production, use, import, and export of persistent organic pollutants and other relevant information provided through the national reports submitted through Article 15. And finally, information on non-compliance provided through procedures that are yet still to be established under the Convention. Article 16 also provides room for additional review of other relevant scientific, environmental, technical, and economic information, and that has been extremely useful in the first evaluation cycle to widen the information base for the evaluation and work towards filling information gaps and data gaps to enable a better informed process. Most importantly, a number of scientific processes and expert processes that have been established under the Convention and work on data generation, compilation, and analysis for various thematic areas, the results of those expert processes have also been channeled to the effectiveness evaluation. And these groups have produced structured and verified reports on their particular topics that have been extremely useful in conducting the effectiveness evaluation in an efficient way, and having this expertise provided through the process has been extremely useful. Moving on to the next slide, this will, I would like to go a bit back to the role of monitoring data for effectiveness evaluation that clearly is central and is one of the key inputs to support the process. The establishment of the Global Monitoring Plan for Persistent Organic Pollutants has been a success and has generated an extremely valuable time series data set that is central in the work to be conducted for effectiveness evaluation. But The GMP can also facilitate additional areas of research that also contribute to this process. It can not only identify and attribute observed changes in POPs concentrations over time, basically this being what is needed as a minimum for effectiveness evaluation, but it can also help in understanding, in approaching global inventories of persistent organic pollutants, in understanding releases and emission patterns, and also help in documenting new substances of concern. The input provided through the global monitoring plan is clearly the outcome of a stable long-term process of international cooperation, working together with strategic partners and implemented through the regional implementation framework through the regional organization groups and the global coordination for the global monitoring plan. And this stable long-term process is the prerequisite to support the scientific basis and the requirements of Article 16. The major recommendation, conclusion and recommendation with respect to the GMP is the need for sustainable continuation of monitoring activities to continue to contribute long-term monitoring data to support effectiveness evaluation. Next slide, please. And yes, with this, I wanted to go to review a bit more in depth the lessons learned from the first cycle of effectiveness evaluation of the Stockholm Convention, because what it was key did not only produce the substantive aspects of the assessment, including conclusions and recommendations pertaining to various areas of implementation of the convention, but it also provided the opportunity to critically review the process and integrate the learning from this first evaluation cycle into a revision of the framework that looks at improving and further streamlining the processes that have been helpful for effectiveness evaluation. Just to mention a few, first, the approach taken in the framework of having this article by article evaluation with clearly defined process indicators and outcome indicators clearly worked well. There was clearly a need to fine-tune some of the aspects, and maybe one area where clearly there is a need for attention and to be mindful of in any process, similar process, is this correspondence between the question that is under evaluation, the indicator, and the data available for use for assessing the indicator, including detailing the limitations that this data may have. The definition of the baseline, and yes, I am sure in a number of similar processes there are interesting discussions on that, because yes, in an ideal world, one would have a consistent baseline for an evaluation. This could be the entry into force of the convention or of its amendments, but clearly information becomes available to the process according to different timelines. So one needs to be mindful about this and have in mind that for different situations, one might have different baselines based on which the first information becomes available. It adds additional complexity to the assessment, and it clearly needs to be factored in properly within the process and within the framework. Coming back to the data availability and issues with respect to data quality, monitoring data have been key, and clearly this is something that has been shown to be a success and to work well under Stockholm. One major limitation came from national reporting as a mainstream of information supporting the effectiveness evaluation with respect to the overall number of reports that have become available to the process, but also in terms of completeness of national reports and issues with respect to quality assurance and quality control of what is reported. Also, we note that the absence of the compliance mechanism also added additional information gaps. There have been mechanisms that have been put in place in this first evaluation cycle to fill these information gaps. And I have mentioned the additional review of other relevant information sources and the value added of having these dedicated scientific processes and other expert processes under the convention, providing this structured information and giving meaning to a large variety of raw data, and that has shown to really be helpful for the process. There also have been a number of recommendations to improve this aspect for the next cycle. And for instance, feedback mechanism on Article 15 reporting has been put in place to look in more depth to how to further support quality reporting of information and providing this information in a meaningful way for effectiveness evaluation. I think I will stop here for the moment with the lessons learned, and hopefully we'll continue later on other topics as well. And thank you very much for the attention, and I can happy pass the floor to the other panelists. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anna, and that's very valuable insight, and to learn about the experiences of the first effectiveness evaluation under the Stockholm Convention. Perhaps for those who are not familiar with our two conventions, it's worthwhile to mention that there is a task force between the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Convention, Minamata Convention, and also the Chemicals and Health branch of UNEP. So we have opportunities to coordinate our activities and discuss such topics like effectiveness evaluation. So we are looking forward to deepening our discussion, exchange of experiences on this topic. I will now move on and will like to invite Jerker to present the perspective of COBSEA, which is one of the 18 regional sea conventions programs around the world working to protect the marine environment. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Monica. Good morning to everyone. Let me just start by saying that COBSEA is one of 18 regional seas and administered by UNEP. So it shares many features of global MEAs, but also differs in some ways. COBSEA brings together 9 countries, East Asian seas, in collaboration on protection and sustainable development of marine and coastal areas. Similar to conventions, there's an intergovernmental meeting, which is the decision-making body through which measures are negotiated and adopted, which makes COBSEA a normative body with an action program, but there is no legally binding convention within COBSEA, so we work on the basis of the East Asian Sea Action Plan. Now, within COBSEA, there are not specific procedures for evaluating effectiveness as things stand, but there are a range of provisions for this, as well as some ongoing efforts, which I will discuss briefly in this presentation here. First of all, the East Asian Seas Action Plan itself places strong emphasis on monitoring and environmental assessment, and it tasks COBSEA with evaluation of results achieved in relation to efforts in the context of the action plan in general, and specifically relating to project activities through COBSEA. Now, if you can go to the next slide, please. Looking specifically at COBSEA's strategic directions, which were adopted by the Intergovernmental Meeting in 2018, there are 2 substantive themes, one on land-based marine pollution, one on marine and coastal planning and management, as well as an overarching governance theme. Each of these themes identifies some measures and specific activities, and the governance theme explicitly addresses COBSEA as a regional policy mechanism and identifies priorities in creating the necessary conditions for COBSEA to efficiently deliver its mandate. Now, that's captured in the purpose statement for the governance theme, which is to provide an effective regional policy mechanism for the coastal and marine environment. There's a section on monitoring and evaluation which defines the purpose of monitoring and evaluation, including measuring progress, assessing performance, and enabling adaptive approaches. Monitoring and evaluation reports on implementation of the strategic directions are presented to intergovernmental meetings, and there will be a terminal evaluation combining aspects of performance evaluation of the current strategic directions and formative evaluation for the development of a future strategic directions document. So there's a number of elements that guide COBSEA and its activities with respect to effectiveness evaluation there. Now, I also want to highlight a few features of COBSEA's Regional Action Plan on Marine Litter that are particularly pertinent to this discussion. Now, that Action Plan on Marine Litter was originally adopted in 2009 and revised on the basis of the current strategic directions, with the revision adopted by the Intergovernmental Meeting in 2019. This identifies, again, 4 main action areas, land-based and sea-based sources, one explicitly on monitoring and assessment, as well as one main action area on activities that support the implementation of the Regional Action Plan on Marine Litter towards the overarching goal of preventing and significantly reducing pollution. Now, this Regional Action Plan on Marine Litter identifies absence of adequate science-based monitoring and assessment as a significant barrier to addressing marine litter. It notes that monitoring and assessment are indispensable in identifying marine litter status and trends and its most critical impacts, as well as to support development, tracking, and evaluation of policy and management interventions. There's detailed activity description that provides for a stepwise approach in establishing harmonized national monitoring programs as a foundation for regional assessment. And the Regional Action Plan on Marine Litter also establishes a working group on marine litter to advise on implementation and to develop and work on the basis of biennial rolling work plans, based on which progress assessment reports will be prepared for the intergovernmental meeting. Can you go to that next slide, please? Basically, this is all to say that there's a very clear intention and indeed a requirement for performance evaluation. And there's a sound basis for this within COBSEA. The building blocks are there towards evaluation of our efforts in terms of whether measures are adopted in line with the action plan and other regional policy instruments, whether these measures speak to policy needs or to the right management levers, and whether measures have the desired impacts in terms of pollution loading or environmental status. So there's many foundational pieces in place, and it's also very clear that on the basis of this, at least perceived effectiveness informs countries in relation to decisions that are taken through COBSEA. Now, that said, while there is a foundation, I think it's fair to say that all those aforementioned aspects contributing to evaluation of effectiveness need further development. And that may include establishing processes and procedures above and beyond what we currently have towards something that ultimately enables us to consider effectiveness of the action plan or COBSEA itself, rather than individual elements thereof. The area where we're making most progress at the moment is in relation to marine litter, and on the basis of the Regional Action Plan that I mentioned before. And that includes ongoing work to strengthen monitoring, including establishing common objectives across national programs, common indicators and harmonized methods, and connecting this in a regional assessment process. We are in the process of establishing a procedure for national reporting on implementation of the Regional Action Plan. And of course, I mentioned tracking of the rolling work plans of our Marine Litter Working Group. All of these are matters that will be further developed in the lead up to our next intergovernmental meeting, and many things should be agreed and adopted by then. I also want to flag that there's an ongoing process which reflects many of those steps, also addressing elements related to marine and coastal management in the context of our our development of an outlook on COBSEA's follow-up and review of ocean-related sustainable development goals. And here I just stress that the model is similar, but it's an ongoing process for consideration. So, of course, not a foregone conclusion. Really, my last point here relates to how this approach within COBSEA may absorb, reflect work of other regional seas and how it can perhaps also benefit other regional seas. The current global strategic directions of the regional seas encompass focus on enhancing effectiveness of regional seas programs, and it identifies some actions to this effect. Now, building on that, there's certainly an argument for putting more emphasis on approaches for evaluating effectiveness as opposed to individual actions in that regard. And as I mentioned, I see considerable utility in building on commonalities across regional seas that share many features, but in this regard, sharing experiences and learning also with global MEAs is absolutely crucial. And so this dialogue here is very helpful in that regard. And I think with that, I want to thank you, Monica, and the other colleagues for this opportunity to participate and engage in a discussion that should hopefully also have a very good impact on the work through COBSEA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerker. Thank you so much. It has been very informative to learn at which stage and what are the plans for the next steps in the COBSEA area. And you also brought the topic of marine litter, which is a topic that has received global recognition and has also been receiving, and many actions have been taken globally to address it. And as you know, also within the Basel Convention, there has recently been an amendment introduced that covers also plastic waste. So that will be also another milestone to address the problem of marine litter. So let's come back to a little bit discussing some of your points later on. And just for the sake of time, I'm now rushing to the next presentation by Dominic, who represents OSPAR, which is another regional sea convention. So the floor is yours, Dominic.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for the opportunity to join. I think just a very brief introduction. I feel very much the new boy here. I've only been in post as the Executive Secretary for 2 or 3 months now at OSPAR, so compared to my fellow panellists, I haven't been doing this role for very long. But prior to that, I was involved in marine issues in the UK, so I do have some sort of a history in this area. I just want to, I'll try and be as brief as possible looking at the time, Monica, but I'll just touch on the sort of the framework that we have in OSPAR for looking at effectiveness evaluation, and then touch on a couple of examples of work that we've got ongoing at the moment in OSPAR. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So as others have sort of touched on, sort of very important, I think, in terms of monitoring effectiveness and effectiveness evaluations is having some sort of basis for that set out in your convention. In OSPAR, when I was looking at this question, I sort of thought, well, what would our contracting parties expect us to, what questions would they expect us to be able to answer in terms of whether or not the convention is being effective? And I guess the starting point is that, our overall objective is protection of the marine environment in the North East Atlantic. So sort of making sure that we're working towards that is the key, but also having a basis for regular assessments on the quality of the marine environment, which we do have set out in our convention, so we can rely on that framework to support our work. And I think crucially, the convention not only talks about sort of having regular assessments of the status of the marine environment, but it also requires that we sort of do assessments of the effectiveness of measures that we put in place through the convention. Now, as previous panelists have mentioned, crucial to being able to carry out effective evaluations is the importance of assessment and monitoring. we're very lucky in OSPAR to have a very long sort of history of assessment and monitoring, goes back sort of decades. I think I would stress that in relation to this particular subject that we're talking about, the importance of science, is that it's vital that those monitoring programs are underpinned by a strong scientific evidence base. And I think in OSPAR, largely speaking, we're pretty good at that. And we have a very large network of scientists who work on our monitoring programs across the sort of broad range of issues that OSPAR looks after, that sort of provide that scientific underpinning of our monitoring programs. And I think another strength of OSPAR is that it makes all of the sort of methodology, the data, the sort of the indicators, the science behind those indicators available on our website, so that this is fully transparent. And I think all of that leads to sort of ensuring that our work is credible, in line with the sort of the points that Michael was pointing out in his presentation. So I think we have a strong basis for undertaking effectiveness evaluations in OSPAR. So if we can move to the next slide. Sorry, just go back. That's it. So just a couple of examples of the work that we're doing. I think obviously under OSPAR we implement a series of measures and actions. And I think as we're coming up in 2020 to the end of our current strategy, our sort of 2010 to 2020 Northeast Atlantic Environment Strategy. And as part of the review of whether or not that's been effective, we've identified that whilst we have put in place the requirements for evaluations of our measures and actions, so that every time a new measure or action is agreed, it's supposed to have a reporting framework that underpins it, that sort of sets out how you report on its implementation and its effectiveness. But I think our reflection on looking back over the last 10 years is that reporting is a bit piecemeal, it's not very visible, and as a result, the sort of our work on measures and actions and their effectiveness hasn't been as good as it could have been. So what we're doing is putting in place a new sort of measures and actions program that will support our contracting parties to improve the sort of regional coordination, to make it fully accessible on a database so that people can see it and compare and contrast. And we're hoping that that will improve implementation and help contracting parties to track progress in implementing their measures and actions. And also, importantly, I think, to enhance visibility and transparency, which I think then in turn sort of leads to sort of greater pressure for those that may be not implementing those measures and actions to implement them, and hopefully sort of result in an improved effectiveness of what we're doing in OSPAR. The culmination of that work will be that in our quality status report in 2023, we will include a sort of an assessment of the effectiveness of measures. I think for the first time in our, or certainly to the extent that we're planning for the first time. It's true to say that we're still working on it at the moment, so it's this opportunity to share ideas is really sort of timely for us. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. And yeah, so my second example of work we're currently doing is on our Marine Litter Regional Action Plan. So building on what Jyrke was talking about, we've also got a regional action plan containing a number of actions, both national and common actions. And I think it came into, see, I'm showing my inexperience here. I think it was agreed in 2014, and we want to include a review of that in our the review of our Northeast Atlantic Environment Strategy. So we've recently commissioned some work on an evaluation of the effectiveness of that plan, and I think it's one of the sort of points I wanted to highlight is that part of that evaluation will be on scientific data and evidence, so looking at the indicators that we've put in place on beach litter, on floating litter, on seabed litter, using the outcomes of those indicators, which are very much at the sort of scientific end of the spectrum in terms of assessment and evaluation. But we also want to look at what I would call sort of less scientific sort of end, which is just looking at implementation. Have contracting parties implemented the measures that have been set out in the Regional Action Plan? Now, just saying you've implemented a measure doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be effective, but it is one measure of showing whether or not the plan has been effective. And then finally, as part of that framework for evaluation, we're going to do some work with our stakeholders to see what they think about whether or not the action plan has been effective. So a range of measures to look at how that plan is operating, and we'll use that as a sort of objective basis for assessing whether or not the plan has been effective to date, but also importantly, how we can improve it going forward. That was it. That's all I had to say. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity. I found the talks so far really useful for me. So yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominic. That's very interesting, and you pointed to the issue of implementation. Implementation is important when the convention starts its operation, and remains important after 4 decades. So whatever we do, we want things to be implemented, and I guess the assessment and evaluation framework is really to assist in that big purpose of all of our organizations. Thank you so much for presenting. We only have 8 minutes left, so I would like us to have a very quick round of discussion, and I would like to ask you to be very brief. I think we would need another hour to really explore each of the interesting topics that you have presented, so I will just try to give you a quick question based on what you have presented, and then to use these remaining minutes in a very efficient manner. So maybe I will start with Anna Maria, and I will then finish with Michael. I have a quite specific question to you, Anna, and you spoke a lot about the importance of monitoring data and good monitoring data. And we know in the Stockholm Convention there are many POPs that are to be monitored and evaluated. In Minamata Convention we have one substance, which is mercury, and its different forms, but still one substance to be monitored. And based on experiences of how the first effectiveness evaluation in the Stockholm Convention has been set up, would you have any thought on a reflection what that may mean for Minamata Convention, if you would like to use experiences and in setting the system, what would be the difference that there is only one substance to be monitored? Anna Maria.
Thank you, Monica, and I would like to thank the presenters well before and after me, and I think, well, through this dialogue, I think there's an opportunity for learning for all of us, and it has been very informative for me to participate in this panel. So first, let me say big thanks to everyone for the contributions and the thoughts here. Yes, monitoring information, well, the experience under Stockholm showed how critical it is to have this framework that provides harmonized, comparable, and consistent data for the purpose of effectiveness evaluation. And with the global monitoring plan, there has been a lot of work and a lot of effort that were channeled towards sort of bringing together the various activities and well-established monitoring programs that were in place at the beginning of the convention, bring it all together in a harmonized, consistent, coherent framework to be able to look at all these pieces of information in a coherent global overview sort of way. With the second phase of implementation of the global monitoring plan, we went even one step further, and we have this new online system which supports the development of the regional monitoring reports and of the global monitoring report for each cycle. It has also proved to be extremely useful and conducive into implementing monitoring activities in a harmonized and consistent way. I think the key point is the issues pertaining to QA/QC, quality assurance, quality control, and enabling the data input for the various programs to be supportive and conducive of a global, truly global and regional assessment as needed for effective evaluation.
Thank you so much, Anna. And as I said, we will be talking to each other more about this issue in the future. I would maybe now move to Jerker, and you mentioned that it would be useful to have to build an approach to effectiveness evaluation in advance, and that there is scope for collaboration between regional sea conventions. We are hearing that in OSPAR there is now a plan to evaluate the effectiveness of marine litter action plan that could be going to that direction. So I don't know whether you would like to reflect a little bit on this issue, and what would be the concrete next steps to have this more comprehensive and more considerate approach that one would plan in advance what would have to be done in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Monica. As you say, we have put a number of things in place. We have a foundation to build on. What's the next step? And I feel the next step is really to keep on walking, so we don't stagnate on the basis of this. We have an agreed pathway towards more structured effectiveness evaluation. So we need to, with our countries and with a good process with them, define this in a way that serves their needs in the context of COBSEA. Now, listening to others speak and in response to your question, bearing in mind that these are things that have evolved differently, but also to a greater extent in other fora, it feels like an opportunity to put together approaches on the basis of proven experiences, on the basis of mistakes made, and on the basis of successes that have been had. And we really look to those opportunities. Among the regional seas, as I mentioned, there's a particular opportunity by virtue of it being something of a family, admittedly very diverse, but still we share a lot, and it's something we'd like to do. Certainly it's something we'll look to in the next regional sea strategic directions. And lastly, as I started off by saying, we want to be really close to the needs of our countries. And in this sense, we have to remain true to that. We have to be somewhat iterative and cautious as well, and not rush ahead too fast if we don't anchor this in a really good dialogue with them. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that point. Definitely, it's a country-driven process. These are the parties who are deciding according to their needs. Thank you for that point. I have now we have a very little time left, but I'm still eager to ask questions to Dominic, and maybe you only have time to answer yes or no. But I know in OSPAR you have done many assessments in the past, and there is more science available to fit into effectiveness evaluation than before. But does more science mean a better assessment system?
Assessments. I think better science leads to better assessment. So it's making sure that your science is targeted at the thing that you're evaluating. And I think just my message, I mean, I agree with a lot of, if not everything that others have said, particularly Jerker in terms of sticking to what our contracting parties want to do. But I think just it's having enough science, enough good science to support what you want to do. You don't need to keep having more and more science. I think marine litter was a really good example of that, where we all knew that there was a problem. We don't need to keep looking and looking for more and more science. We just need to get on and tackle it. So better science, not just more science.
Thank you so much. That was answer to the point. Now I think we have to finish, and I had a really good question to Mike about involving other scientific expertise than natural science. It's still not very often practiced to have environmental economists or social scientists involved, but we don't have time really to talk to that point, and I hope we'll have in the future. I have to close our event. I would like to say that I really enjoyed our discussions and listening to you. And regional sea conventions, whether administered by UNEP or not, and global conventions on chemicals and waste conventions, we share a similar agenda, and many hazardous substances, plastic, end up in the sea, and it's especially very true for mercury, which is a major concern in many sea areas around the world. So I'm very much looking forward to our collaboration in the future. And maybe that's it. Have a good day, have a good evening, and I hope to see you next time.
Thanks, Monica.
Thanks, everyone.